Steve Newton, would you lead us in prayer in a minute? Okay, thanks, Steve. All right, can everybody hear me okay? I've got a new audio setup, so just want to make sure things are coming through clearly. Thanks for confirming that. All right, we are in Acts chapter 23, picking up there this afternoon. So if you haven't turned over there already, you can turn over to chapter 23. Last week, Jason led us through 21, 22, and the beginning of chapter 23, as we looked at Paul's arrival in Jerusalem through the end of his travels. And so as we've noted before, this last kind of quarter of Acts focuses on these trials of Paul as he's traveled and spent many years proclaiming the gospel. We had some discussion in class about his desire to return to Jerusalem and directions apart from that, but we see his commitment to do this. Of course, there's a lot of history that Paul has with Jerusalem, right? He's was one of the leaders before his conversion of those who were persecuting Jews. But it's also been many years since he was in Jerusalem, for an extended time at least. And I think it's easy to forget when we're going through Acts how much time has elapsed throughout many of these things, right? We're at a point now here in these chapters where it's almost 30 years, 25 to 30 years since Jesus was crucified, and potentially 20 years or more, depending on some questions around the dating of Acts chapter 9, between the time that Paul put on Christ himself and became a follower of God. So it's an extended period of time. And as much as there was this connection that Paul had with the Jews of the city when he was there, it seems in many cases that many people have turned over, right? He's still got family there. He still has connections and is still certainly known by many. But at the same time, you see this scene has changed. The way he's received is very hostile. We'll see here as we go through our chapters this week, of course, though, that part of what's going on is the Jews from Asia have followed him down. And so you think back to Acts chapter 13 when Paul began his journeys, and we saw him going through the interior of Asia, cities like Lystra and Iconium and Derbe. And we saw a pattern start immediately once he arrived in that first city, that he was being pursued and followed by Jews who were hostile to the message that he was proclaiming of God. And so this has stirred up again the situation here. You've got a group of people who know him, but also a group that have come from others and stirred up the situation here. And so we looked at his arrest and his initial defense that he made in class on Wednesday, and then we'll spend our time this week, Lord willing, looking at two additional defenses that Paul makes. In his first defense, in the first exchanges that we looked at last week, it's primarily a defense to the Jews that have arrested him and the leaders that have arrested him from the Jewish people. But this week, the defenses that he makes are more towards a Roman audience, the Roman government and leadership. We'll see Agrippa come in on Wednesday, who is of Jewish background, but also closely connected to the Roman government. So he's kind of got a blended connection there, but we'll see that change this week as we go forward. But before we go any further, Steve, if you would go ahead and lead us in prayer, please.
Let's pray together, please. Our gracious Father, thank you for this gift of today, for your blessings, for continue our worship now. Thank you for Andrew and Jason leading us through this account of the actions of Jesus through the apostles and now primarily Paul. We're grateful for his growth, his faith, his trust in you in when things were going well, but especially help us to see him giving himself to you through trials and struggles. And as Andrew just mentioned, Paul's willingness to share his journey in Christ, both to bring others to you and to show his past and the grace that you've offered him through Jesus. Please help us to be willing to do the same, to open ourselves up to others, to show what you have done in us and with us and through us and through your Son. Continue to bless our study. It's good to see Dolores. May you bless her in this continued transition with the passing of Mark and the rest of their family. May you bless them all. Bless us as we support each other. Help us, as Paul does, to see the hope of eternity with each step in this life. Help us to live to that end for our benefit and for your glory. Bless Andrew as he walks us through our study today. It's through Jesus that we pray. Amen.
All right, thanks, Steve. As you think back to what we looked at last week, and particularly as Paul makes his defense, there's kind of two parts to it, right? There was the initial defense that he makes upon his arrest, and you see his opportunity to speak and turn to the crowds, and yet they're stirred up against them. And then we see this other scene where he's before the council in chapter 23. And what point, as you think back and remember just kind of bringing forward some key pieces of that, what point in particular does Paul say is the crux of all of this? On the surface, right, the arrest and the scene that is brought about is the result of this claim that is made that he is not respecting the Jewish law and the customs that were a part of that. But what does Paul bring out in chapter 23 that he says is really the crux of this matter in the first few verses of 23?
He says in chapter 6 that it is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial.
Yeah. And it's easy in the context of chapter 23 and the comment about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. I think it's easy to look at that and think that Paul was just looking for an opportunity to divide the people who were against him. And certainly that observation had that impact, right? But as you think back through all of the lessons that we've seen through Acts, which, as we've commented many times before, Acts is maybe primarily even a series of lessons. As you think about all the lessons that we've had, what key point is in each one of those lessons? What are they, no matter where they start, no matter what audience that is presenting, what key point is brought up in each of those lessons?
Jesus being raised from the dead.
Yeah, exactly. With all the history, the way it's told maybe with different audiences, right? It always comes to that particular point that is at the heart of each of these things. This truth about the resurrection of this man Jesus who was crucified. He was resurrected. He is the Son of God. That resurrection proves that he's the Son of God and proves that he now has authority to reign over all. And so when Paul makes this point here, while contextually it serves to divide his audience, we recognize that it's consistent with all the teachings that have happened so far. And as we go forward, we're going to realize he's going to come back to that same point again. So it's not just a ploy or a mechanism that is being used here to win an argument. It is the crux. And I think that observation is important as Paul makes it here and in other places that we're going to read, because it helps us appreciate that for all the circumstances surrounding these trials that we see in these persecutions, the point that Paul keeps coming back to is this is what's at stake. This is what's in question. The truth of the resurrection and the meaning of the resurrection is what's on trial. And so Paul will make that, and it's easy, I think, to read through that and take it for granted, but to realize that for all those other things that we see in the circumstances that we see around these trials and discussions, that this ultimately is coming back to the resurrection and carrying that truth forward and carrying that message out. And so I just want to appreciate that as we go forward in these lessons, to realize the significance of the point that he makes there in 23 when he calls that out there in verse 6. If you want to look again, He says, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee of son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial." And there's a lot that we could, potentially unpack from that statement, right? And what he means by it is with respect to the hope and the resurrection that I am on trial. But in summation, I think, we might understand that if this is not true, right, then the whole thing falls apart, right? That the whole argument, the whole situation, everything that Paul is doing is dependent on that resurrection. And as we saw him make the point with the Jews, right, he's got this connection to them. He has this history with them. He has this understanding. He has shown his respect for their traditions. You think back to chapter 16 when right after chapter 15 says that circumcision is not necessary, he circumcises Timothy because of his respect for this law and its traditions and the way people observe that. And so his point is not the lack of respect, but his point is that this resurrection has happened and it has changed the situation, right? And so that's what he's drawing out. And so for all the concern that people have about the customs, he's trying to bring them back to the understanding of the truth of the resurrection as he makes his defense. And I think that, for me, just high level, even without walking through, all the other details of the argument, it can be easy to lose that perspective in my life, to think about it's not these other things sometimes that people want to debate on that really the debate is about. It's about where is my hope, and my hope being on the resurrection. And when I find that I am not aligned with someone else, oftentimes it comes back to an understanding of a fundamental truth like that. John?
That's okay. I'll save it for later.
Okay.
For Felix.
Yep. All right. So as we pick up in chapter 23, then we looked there. It said the first half of 23 on Wednesday with Paul's defense before the council. We see in the middle of the chapter, we won't read through it all in detail, but we see in the middle of a chapter that we've got this situation here where the exchange has stirred up people so much that now you have this group of 40 individuals who have vowed that they're not going to eat until Paul is dead. His words, his defense has stirred up such anger and hostility that there can be no outcome except his death. And we'll probably continue to mention this at different points in times, right? But you just see these echoes of the trial of Jesus in this, and this intention to have Jesus killed, to have Jesus executed. You see that his defense, you think about when Jesus was before the council, right? You had all these claims made about him and they couldn't prove it. And ultimately, Jesus himself gives them the proof, quote unquote, that they were looking for, which is that he was claiming to be the Son of God, this truth that was going to change things. And they rejected him for that. And then you see this commitment to crucify him and the process play out. And so we see a lot of parallels in that as we go through Paul's story as well. So this plot is made. We see the nephew of Paul hears about this plot and takes it to Paul, and who tells the Roman authorities, Paul understanding how they would have reacted in this case, informs them. You get a sense when Paul's acting here, as much as we saw his lead up to Jerusalem, his commitment to do whatever was necessary, he's also not in this kind of state of, well, if it happens, it happens either, right? He recognizes the opportunity that he has. And so even though he's prepared to die, and he's made that point, that he's prepared for sufferings and tribulations and persecutions, even to the point of death, he's prepared himself for that. He's also not just given in and going to let whatever happens happen. He recognizes the opportunity that he has. And so he objected before when they were about to flog him because of his citizenship. And now in this case, with this information, he sends the information on so that the authorities would know, and they make a plan to get him out of Jerusalem and take him down to the coast where he can be protected from some of the fervor that exists here in Jerusalem. And so in the last section in the chapter, beginning in verse 23, we see this large contingent of soldiers on horseback and spearmen and these two sentries going with him, and they write this letter. And so let's read the letter that is sent in verse 26 to Felix as it kind of starts to set up what we're going to see in chapter 24. So chapter 23, beginning verse 26. Claudius Lysias, to his excellency the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving or death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, and on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. And so, as much as Paul emphasized in that statement that he was on trial with regard to the resurrection, this letter says the observation of the Roman official is that it's on the uproar is over matters of the law, right? And so you see again this kind of disconnect between what really is the crux of this and what's being presented. And so that kind of sets the scene now for what we see in chapter 24, as Paul is going to have an opportunity to make his defense in front of Felix. Let me pause there before we jump into that, though, and see if there's any other things you want to draw out from chapter 23, your question there. All right, so as we look at chapter 24, as Paul now is here before Felix, a couple of historical notes can be interesting about Felix himself. Felix was a Roman official, a governor of some sort over this area. He was someone that, his path to power was somewhat sordid, and some of the connections that he had that got him his position. And he was also a very harsh governor. He was known for actions that would, in today's terminology, perhaps be referred to as crimes against humanity. So he was harsh against his people, but yet in some ways he was also viewed as being effective, because as we've noted even in the time of Pilate, right, that one of the chief jobs of a Roman governor was to keep peace in an area so that the empire didn't have to put a lot of resources in an area that they had already conquered. So he's also in a situation of immorality. It's believed that his Drusilla was maybe not his wife at all, but to the extent she was his wife, it was his third wife, and may have had other marriages. So, Paul's in this situation where he's going before this official who was somewhat known for his lack of compassion, for his lack of humanity, we might say, who's in a mixture of a variety of immoralities. And so this is the type of individual that Paul is standing before as he makes his case and as he makes his defense. And so just keep that in mind. We'll come back to that a little bit later in the chapter. But I want to read together this section before we talk through it. So let's pick up in verse 1 of chapter 24 then. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, Knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. And they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple, without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you, and to make an accusation should they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council, other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. And so as we see this argument laid out, what case in this situation is the Jewish spokesman or the spokesman for the Jewish leaders? What case is he pressing now against Paul?
I guess it seems to me that he's being accused of stirring up unrest, which was something the Romans were particularly unfond of other nations or nationalities under their jurisdiction creating. They wanted a peaceful society. And so with Paul appearing to stir up or making the accusation that Paul was stirring up unrest and riot, that would bring him under stringent attention by the Roman government.
It's not the case focused on whether he is a respecter of the law, right? At least not in its simplest form. That's not the case that he's making this time. It's more of a case of how it impacts the Roman peace overall. John?
I see where yours starts out sweetening up Felix. Felix is kind of like a pancake having a bunch of syrup pulled over him. And that's probably how Felix felt. And there's at least 4 charges here. Some of them John mentioned. The ones I can see, they say he was a real pest. He stirs up dissension. He's a ringleader, which means more or less they accredit Paul as being the leader of this way. And then they say he tried to desecrate the temple, or at least implied that. And so there's 4 different charges there. And then also they kind of slandered the commander a little bit there, because what they said wasn't actually quite true about that.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a couple of issues with how they recall the arrest. Think about the charges against Paul. Are they true? Think about what we've read throughout Acts so far.
Depends on how you define pest, maybe.
Right. So what's the distinction there?
Well, when I think of a pest, I think of something that's bothersome. So he was definitely bothersome to them.
Okay. He was bothersome. Steve, did you have?
Well, Paul himself says, I did not do these things. He lists a couple examples of when he was in the temple and nor the synagogue, nor in the city have I done stirred up any of this unrest. And as you just mentioned at the beginning of our study, just mentioning the resurrection is all it took in some cases for the crowd to go into dissension over this, and more arguing among themselves than with Paul, it seems.
Yeah. You think back to Paul's travels, right? Starting all the way back in chapter 13 leading up to this. And there's an element where you can see some element of truth into what's being said here, right? How many times have we read about conflict? How many times have we read about a city getting stirred up? How many times have we read about the peace, quote unquote, of a place being upended because of this message, right? And the distinction is Paul, of course, had no objective, right, to stir up people and to create these scenes of riots. You think back to what happened in Ephesus with the silversmiths and those who were, putting these idols together. Paul had no intention to cause any unrest within these societies or these places in the way that it developed. But yet the message had that impact in many cases because people, I shouldn't say the message had that impact, but people's response to the message led to that. Right. And so you look at this and you look at what they're saying here, there is a sense in which he was a ringleader, right? He was a leader spreading this message and bringing people. But it's in the perspective that you bring to that and the way that you view his intentions in carrying this out and the intention of the message. And so what he's done has caused conflict and difficulties in lots of places. And we've read that throughout these chapters. But what we've understood in those chapters 13 through 19 is that it was never Paul's intention to do that. He was carrying this message and trying to reason people in a respectful way, to reason with them about the message, whether Jew or Gentile, whether they had a knowledge of the law and the writings of the prophets or no knowledge of those things, right? Paul has been trying to get this message out. He's been working to deliver this message out, and it has caused a lot of challenges along the way, but it's never been his intention. It's never been his goal to create unrest or to create these kinds of things. And so, as you look at least those two pieces of what he's been charged with, it is connected to the truth of what we've seen happen. But we understand, of course, that that's not what Paul was trying to achieve, that those things happened as a result of the rejection of the message that he was delivering and the hardness within the people who were oftentimes hearing this. And so, the leader of the Jews says there in verse 8, examine him yourself and you'll be able to find out from him about everything about which we accuse him. And so you wonder, as he kind of sets that up, he's telling Felix, say, hey, just ask him. He's going to tell you about these things. And again, it's one of those situations where the facts, so to speak, are maybe not in question about what has happened in Paul's ministry and his work, but it's the understanding behind those that is key to this situation. John, then Natalie?
I believe that these elders that came along, or the Jews that did come along with the high priest here, I don't know if they're from the sect of the Pharisees or not, or some of the Sadducees, maybe some of both. But what Paul's declaring to them in verse 15, he says, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. And the thing is, what he is preaching is the same thing what they believe, essentially. So they have no charge against him. If they would, it'd be the same charge they had labeled against themselves. So it's very hypocritical and not good.
Yeah, we're gonna get more than that, especially in his defense, right? Natalie? Can't see you, Natalie, but you may be muted if you're trying to.
Sorry, I bumped the button accidentally.
Oh, okay.
My bad.
Didn't mean to call you out.
No problem.
All right. So as he's made this accusation, as he's made this charge against that, as we think now to what Paul has said here in his defense, the case has been made. He acknowledges Felix, right? So to the point that the Jews show some acknowledgement of Felix as well. We see Paul excited or cheerfully in my translation making this defense. He then goes into the facts of the situation, right? I wasn't in Jerusalem for more than 12 days. Since I went into the city, I wasn't disputing or stirring up with this crowd. I mean, certainly they had a dispute with him, right? And a crowd resulted, but it wasn't Paul's intention or it wasn't his action to go in or to dispute with this crowd, whether in the temple or the synagogues. And they can't bring this to you. And so in verse 14, the key thing that he starts to call out here is it's according to the way which they call a sect that I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. And so what Paul lays out here is it's not a disregard for the law and the prophets that I have. His point is it's my conviction, my commitment to these things and to what was taught that has led me to this. You know, we made this point several times in the Gospels and even in the study in Acts so far as well, that what we see here is not a change or a deviation from what God had laid out from the beginning, right? And that's what Paul is trying to make here. What he's doing, what he's teaching, what he's sharing, the message that he's delivering is not a rejection of the law. It's not a rejection of the message of the prophets and of the things that were carried in this covenant with the Jewish people. This is the continuation of this. What you're seeing, what has happened, what is unfolded is the continuation of this work. It's the continuation of this belief in the law and the things that were laid down in it and written by the prophets. And so I have this hope, he says in verse 15, a hope in God that these men too accept, right? There's not a disagreement as he's drawing it out in this case about that there is a hope that has been promised and committed to in the law and the prophets. We have this hope, a hope in God, which these men accept. And here he's talking probably specifically to the leaders of the Pharisees are the ones that have come down to the point earlier about the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees and their belief about the resurrection. He says they themselves accept that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. And so again, his point is not that I've got a disrespect for these things. His point is not that I'm trying to overthrow these things. He's not trying to make the point that these things need to be forgotten and put aside. And this just isn't his defense in this case, right? This is the summation of the message that he's been carrying throughout. That all these things point to this hope and resurrection that has been promised. And so it's to this that he is committed, and it's to this that he has his hope, and that he worships God believing these things. And for that reason, in verse 16, he's always taken pains to have a clear conscience towards both God and man. And so you, again, just appreciate his message here is not that, you know, all these things that everybody says about me are untrue. His point is these things that are at discussion, they lead to this hope, they lead to this resurrection. And that's what I believe is happening and has happening, is, you know, to paraphrase a little bit what he's saying here. And so in verse 17, what was Paul actually trying to do when he came to Jerusalem? Probably helps us understand some of his commitment that we see expressed in chapters 19 and 20 and 21. What was it that Paul had as his aim as he was coming to Jerusalem?
He was bringing alms, so we know from other texts and so forth that he had been collecting gifts from the saints of Christians all over the world to bring to Jerusalem at this time. So he was delivering those collections. Yeah. So he's been working, as John mentioned, through other texts. We know more details about what he's doing here, but he's been working to put together these gifts from people around the world, literally, or at least around the areas of his travels, and to prepare this gift that he could bring to Judea. And so his desire has been to come to Jerusalem to bring this gift, not to stir things up, not to create dissension, not to create conflict, but his desire has actually come to do this good thing for the people of his nation, the people of Judea, the people of Jerusalem, as we see laid out in other texts. And so he's coming, you know, while he's portrayed as this pest or this plague, you know, who's had literally a worldwide impact was their charge, right? Not just in Judea, but in other places of the world. He actually says, I've come to this city, I've come at this point in time to bring these alms, to bring these gifts, to bring these offerings for my people. And it's while doing this, he says, that they found me purified without any crowd around me. And then we see in verse 18 again that statement about the Jews from Asia that have come and stirred some of this up, you know, and says they ought to be the one to bring here and to present this charge, or to let them say that what wrongdoing they found in me, other than this one thing again,
that is with respect to the resurrection of the dead, that I am on trial before you this day. So Paul again comes back to the point that it's my belief in what has happened in the resurrection and in what is to come and how this is to come. It's my belief in that is ultimately the source of this trial and this disagreement and dissension here that is being presented. Other thoughts or things you want to draw out from Paul's defense here in verses 10 through 21?
I wonder, would I be correct in thinking that in verse 17, there is probably kind of a reference back to Acts 21:18 and following, where Paul came to Jerusalem, the elders advised him how to conduct himself as to not cause problems with some of the Jews there and some of the rumors they were hearing about him, where he had to shave his head, purify himself, and take some other gentlemen, which he had to pay for their getting head shaved and other things to go into the temple. I imagine that's probably what he was referring to there some years earlier, or some time earlier.
Right. Yeah, definitely there seems to be a connection to that. But, to the extent that he went to the temple, he didn't do it with a disrespect or a disregard for the laws and the customs around it, but in a purified state. Other thoughts from Paul's defense? So as he concludes this defense, we see in verse 22 an interesting fact here that Felix has, my translation reads, a rather accurate knowledge of the way. There's a little bit of a manuscript or a translation question about what is meant there. So if you're reading a different translation, it may come across as a different way, and there still is, like I said, some question about what exactly was meant by that statement, what he had knowledge of precisely. But in any case, it seems to be that these things were not completely new to Felix, and so he hears this thing. He puts off the case that's being made against Paul, the accusations that has been made, and he refers now to when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. And ultimately, there's no decision in this, right? It's a hung jury, we might say, in some case. And so he tells that the soldiers should go off and to put Paul in custody, but to give him to some liberty, and let his friends attend to his needs there. But in verse 24, as we read the last few verses here in this section, we recognize that the Felix wasn't just completely disregarding what had gone on here. He says in verse 24, after some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who, as we mentioned before, was one of multiple wives or multiple in a series that he's had some connection to. But she was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. So he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So we see that even though Felix has put Paul aside, he's not been willing to enter into a judgment in this case. And he doesn't seem to be convinced of any charges against him, but he's not willing to let him be released. We realize that he's continuing to have these discussions with Paul. And we see this term that we've seen in several cases in verse 25 about Paul reasoning. Paul's been reasoning with this leader Felix. And look at what it is that he's reasoning about in this case. Verse 25, righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment. Remember the description that we talked about at the beginning of the chapter of the kind of person that Felix was. Someone that by almost any account was not respectful as it regards morality and the treatment of others and the way in which he lived his life. And yet you've got this apostle, this ambassador of God, before this leader of the empire, having an opportunity on occasion after occasion to reason with him about righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment. John?
Yes, this is definitely a good, what you might call 3-point sermon for Felix and his wife. because of what you described earlier, and what I can remember some things about him. He got his post by what you might say graft and craft, both those things, as well, still another man's wife. And she was like only 20 at the time, I think, when she was here. So, but the thing is, this righteousness was toward men, and self-control was, for Felix himself, he needed self-control himself, as well as speaking about the judgment to come, toward God. And that's probably what really scared him.
Yeah, we don't know exactly, but there's several things there. You think about, Steve, go ahead.
It seems too that whatever Felix had heard about the way and or Paul, that when Paul got face to face with him, this is not the guy that I've been hearing about. His respect, his care, his saying, if others have accusations, maybe these Jews from Asia should be here explaining that. I'm telling you what I have done. And so that is intriguing to Felix. And I remember in high school, there was a club about origins concerning creation versus evolution. And Amanda chose not to be a part of the group, even though she is a creationist, because of the way that they presented themselves, the arguments, the disrespect. And so she said, well, I agree with some of what they're saying, but I do not agree with the way that they're coming across. And so keeping that in mind for us as well, that when people actually meet us, they have lots of things, evidence about Christians or those professing to follow Christ. And we may change the tone just by our demeanor and behavior and respect, as Paul has done here.
Yeah, you think about all going back to Jesus, and when he sent his followers out, his apostles, and then larger groups, and he built them up. What did he prophesy then would ultimately happen with them? What situations would they find themselves in?
You're talking about Matthew 10, where they would be brought before people and the Holy Spirit would give them what and how to say what was appropriate?
Yeah, don't worry about the situations that you're going to be in. The Holy Spirit's going to be there. Jesus even made the point that you're going to be brought before kings and rulers of this world, right? And so we see those prophecies, as we've mentioned before in Acts, that part of what we're intended to see here is the prophecies of Jesus being played out in these events. And so Jesus had told his people they were going to have this opportunity. And you think about, from purely human, man-made ways, how would this Jew have this opportunity to stand before this ruler and reason with him about things like this? And as we look at that, right, we hopefully see God's hand in these events. It would be difficult for us in those situations, those circumstances, to understand. You think about the warnings against going to Jerusalem and the people pleading with Paul not to do this, and don't mean to be critical of those people, right? But by our view of the world, by our view of how things unfold and whatnot, we would perhaps say that those were reasonable thoughts to not go into this place, to not go into this situation. Yet we see it leads to this opportunity for the gospel to be proclaimed on many occasions, as is suggested here, and reasoned with this official about the way and these things, particularly about righteousness, self-control, and judgment. McAfee's?
I agree that we have to be careful about how we say things, but I also wonder if it's like Esther, how do you know you weren't brought to this point for this purpose, to say something? And we know that saying something is going to offend people that don't appreciate the truth. And so I'm not disagreeing with Steve, but I'm also asking the question is, when is it appropriate? How do we know, there's a time for this, there's a time for that, there's a time for tearing and a time for sowing, there's a time for war and a time for peace. And I just wonder, how do we have the wisdom to know when to speak boldly the truth of something, knowing that it's going to inflame people's passions against us, which Jesus said that if people hate you, they're going to hate you because of me. And that's understandable. So anyway, I'm just wondering, a little bit of a balanced question here.
Yeah, we don't want to overlook opportunities, right? That are with themselves, and we're blessed by many opportunities, right? To decide how we proclaim this message, and the key is making sure that we're doing it with the way that God has proclaimed, and not trying to carve out our own ways and our own opportunities, just to perhaps win an argument rather than to really compel someone. John?
It kind of reminds me that what I've always thought, we can disagree with someone, but disagree agreeably. And it reminds me of what Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. So, you can approach them with gentleness and reverence, and openly, with respect, and disagree agreeably, and go from there.
Yeah, John Christian?
I'm good. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, I think to Scott's point, we need to share the truth, but I've been asked questions at work at different times about controversial issues, and people were surprised that I didn't just kind of give in to not expressing a biblical perspective that led to some conflict. I think it's because of my emotionalism and things like that, wow, I didn't think you would, say that. And I said, well, this is not easy for me to say, but if God and his word says it and makes this determination, then I can't go against that. And so in those cases, I don't want to shy away from God's truth, but also want to be careful how I present it, not to win an argument, but to plant and water.
Yeah.
So,
John, good.
Yeah, somebody will throw something in. It's just one thing. There was a parallelism that it's been kind of alluded to, but to me it's kind of powerful in John 16 when Jesus is talking to his apostles about sending the Comforter. He characterizes the message of the Comforter that he will convince the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment, which is basically the same three things that are mentioned that Paul is approaching Felix with. And John mentioned that could be a good outline for a sermon, but it's also a great outline for me to think about how I am approaching other people. What message do I need to be getting across to other people? I need to be sharing that there's a right way to do things, that there's a right way to live, and that there's also sin or self-control issues that are the wrong way to do things. And we're going to be held accountable for our choice in those matters. And to me, that presents a very straightforward kind of a pattern to think of to help direct my thoughts as to how am I trying to influence people in the way that, and for them to hear the things that they need to hear. I think most people recognize there's a right way to do things. There's a way that's not right to do things. And the thought that we're going to be held accountable is, reasonable to a lot of people as well. The other thing related to the manner of approach, back when we were doing Peacemakers last summer, we at one point had a lot of emphasis on in Ephesians 4:16 about speaking the truth in love, and then also we used a secular comment that's been used recently, this parallel that kindness, truth without kindness is cruelty. And so, it's not, I don't think it has to be, I think Steve is bringing this out well also, is it doesn't have to be an either or, it's not truth is harsh or mean, and kindness is, without teeth. We should have both of those. We need to be able to speak the truth and to speak it in kindness or in love. And to me, that takes mental preparation. We're told that the teachers are to convict those false teachers in meekness, and so to do that with a meek spirit takes to me a lot of concentration and forethought about how am I going to say things, and how am I going to control body language and voice tone that are just extremely challenging, and only come with I think for most of us quite a bit of effort, but we can do it, and we're expected to do it. But that's I agree with Scott. It's a challenge, and sometimes it feels like they're contradictory. But actually, if we are filled with the fruit of the Spirit, we can do them together at the same time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an element too, maybe in some of this, at least for me, as I think about personal situations where oftentimes I'll find myself fixated on the thing. Should I be doing this? Should I be engaging in this effort? Should I be participating in this effort to spread the gospel and support this message? And yet there are so many opportunities throughout the day that I am confronted with the opportunity to say something, or to point out an error, or the difference in the way that people are talking, the error in that. And it's those opportunities along the way that maybe I'm not thinking about as much, but I'm shrinking back from, when I should be using them and engaging in them. And I think that's part of what Jesus's point was in some of those instructions, right? Or the opportunities are going to unfold, right? The opportunities are going to present themselves. And be prepared that they're going to come, that you'll have this aid and this assistance with that. But sometimes I can find myself that, I'm fixating on, should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? Should I be in this form or whatever? And yet at the same time, find myself shrinking from the opportunities that I do have. And those are the pieces, those are the times when clearly in Scripture, Jesus and others are making the point to be prepared and take those opportunities to teach and to encourage and to admonish and rebuke as well. And yet in those occasions, I often find my boldness lacking. If I'm in a situation at work, and there's others, and seemingly the point of the conversation is on some other topic, but yet there's some belief point to be drawn out there, I'll just shrink away and not take advantage from the opportunity. And what we see here with Paul and this journey, and with others in Acts, right, is that when they found themselves in those situations, right, it's then that they've been ready and been prepared and spoken with boldness in those situations, even if some of the other ways in which that we could pursue, and we choose not to. But it's being ready that what comes, I'm going to be speaking with boldness. And as we were kind of talking about at the outset of this, right, it's recognizing that God is going to use us in ways that we can't even perhaps be anticipating. Paul didn't know what was going to wait him when he got to Jerusalem, what was going to unfold, other than there was going to be a tough road for him, right? And yet here we see him on this journey, speaking before high officials, and then ultimately, of course, we know this leads to an even higher official from a secular perspective. But you see that playing out, and you see what God is doing with Paul in this situation. Other things you want to draw out from this chapter and what has happened to date?
Kind of a note there. I know we didn't quite finish the chapter, but down verse 27, where it tells about Festus succeeding Felix, I have myself a note written there that this happened at 60 AD. So it gives us a time reference of what was going on. And I'm not sure where I got that from. Probably something I studied in the past, but I had myself a note there anyway. So
Yep, yeah, it's right there in that time frame of 59 or 60 that this is likely was written. We see Felix has left Paul in prison throughout this time, right? And there's some, again, suggestions made that he was leaving him in there solely for the sake of trying to extort money from him, and that certainly is brought up here. But we also don't know how much he's interested in hearing this message. And in either case, we know that Paul is using the opportunity presented to him to work and to teach and to convey these things. And so ultimately, at the end, his reason for leaving Paul in prison, even though he's being recalled, is his desire to do the Jews a favor. As he's going back to Rome, there's speculation about whether, he would then have charges pressed against him by the Jews for the ways in which he had treated them. And so that often gets brought up if you dig into the historical context behind this. But in either case, we see Paul has spent a couple of years now in prison with some ability to teach and to converse with others. And so in chapter 25, Lord willing, on Wednesday, we'll pick up and we'll see now that the Festus, so to speak, inherits the situation. He's going to consider it again, and he's going to bring it up to Agrippa, who's kind of the Jewish leader at this point, non-religious leader of the Jewish nation. And so we'll see in chapter 25 and ultimately then chapter 26, Paul's defense before Agrippa as he goes back to what he recounted before about his conversion and all these things that have led up to this. He's going to walk through this. And again, as you read through that in preparation for class on Wednesday, think to yourself, if you can, and try and process through that and say, what is the crux of this? Why is he actually on trial? What is it that is leading all these things to come about? And how does Paul address that throughout his defense? Because what we recognize is that what Paul is making is not a defense of himself personally, although that's part of it, right? But Paul's making a defense for his belief in this resurrection, right? And that's what he's laying out here in this chapter 26 as he has this opportunity to speak before these leaders. And so we'll pick up with that and spend some more time on that thought on Wednesday. Anything else we want to share with our class today? All right, well, hearing nothing, I hope you have a good start to your week, and Lord willing, we'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew. Love you.